Hello and welcome to the latest edition of the Kurdistan Connection here on Media News with myself, Matt Broomfield. The subject that we're going to talk about today is a very important one. It's one that here at Media News we're always trying to discuss and put the kind of Kurdish perspectives, the Kurdish case, the Kurdish question into the context of what's going on in the Middle East at the moment. You know, I don't need, I think, to recap what's happening following Israel's genocidal war on Gaza, which began following the October 7 attacks and which has since spiraled and is growing into a regional conflict with multiple dimensions, in which Kurdistan is just one of the regions which is very deeply affected by this situation. We'll speak more about that today, but yeah, I wanted to invite our guest today, Elif Genç, to join us. Elif, you're welcome.
Hi, nice to be here.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. Elif is studying a doctorate in anthropology at the University of Toronto, also looking at issues related to the Kurdish question. She's also co-chair of the Canadian Kurdish Community Centre, and she is, even before sort of the most recent crisis, has written about the structural, historic, political links, ties, tensions, relations between the Kurdish and Palestinian causes. It's a very complicated issue, and one which has, of course, come up a lot recently. So yeah, Elif, perhaps we could just begin in quite a general sense. Could you place this question in a historical context? What are the historical ties, the similarities, the links between the Kurdish and Palestinian struggles?
So historically, I mean, they share, as far as sort of colonial and like anti-colonial movements against for emancipation, for struggle. They definitely share that in common. I mean, you could say there's very few people in this world there's very few groups in this world that are as involved, as stateless as the Palestinians, and then certainly as the Kurds, right? In terms of, ethnicities or peoples that are colonized across, in the case of Palestine, Israel, in the case of Kurdistan, Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey, of course. I would also say that, so what they also share in common, which is a little less unknown, but very imperative right now, is the fact that they were together in Bekaa Valley in the 1980s, up until I think about the 1990s. And it was, of course, a beacon, it was an epicenter for leftist groups at the time. So, of course, it wasn't just, PKK that was going there, like Kurdish Workers' Party that was going there. In fact, I think there were other Kurdish groups initially, even some Turkish leftist groups, but also, of course, we know like Angola, Cuba. I mean, it was just this epicenter. But what is so interesting is that that's where the PKK had their Masum Korkmaz Academy, and I think it was there until about the 90s. And with that, of course, came a lot of solidarity between the two groups, because it was the PFLP, like the Palestinian People's Front for Liberation of Palestine, and MFLP, so the Marxist Front for Liberation of Palestine, if I'm saying that correctly, that were, in charge of the camp. So even during the war in Lebanon in the early 1980s, there's always this hearkening back to the fact that we have 13 shaheed or martyrs that were killed by Israel and fighting, for the emancipation of, fighting for the Palestinian people in Lebanon in the early 1980s. So that's tradition, and that tradition has still actually, like that solidarity we've seen many examples of it over the years, with Leila Güven, Leila Güven and Leila Khalid, visiting Leila Güven when she was doing her hunger strike in 2019. Leila Khalid, I believe, attended like the third Congress of the HDP. I mean, there's been, a lot of evidence of this ongoing solidarity between these groups, like this, this faction of the Palestinian struggle, and then our Kurdish liberation movement. And I believe there's been a lot of, as well, Kurdish women and Palestinian women have been, trying to find feminist solidarity networks, up until throughout this horrible conflict. So there's lots of, sorry, I don't want to go, I don't want to go on too much, but just, I wanted to just set that as the historical sort of framework.
And I think it's important. Yeah, it's important that you note is in Kurdish circles, it's quite often mentioned this sort of historic links. As you mentioned, there have been more recent efforts, particularly from the Kurdish women's movement, to kind of foster these ties between the two movements. At the same time, it's not the case that today there are sort of Kurdish and Palestinian organizations like side by side on the same front lines. What are the reasons for that? What's changed over the past decades?
Yeah, so I guess I sort of became more familiar with this issue, and it just kind of, I've just become sort of consumed with it ever since. But it was about 2017, 2018, when I realized, because, it seems like it would be safe to assume that Kurdish movement and Palestinian movement would be together in the struggle of oppressed peoples against, the capitalists or whatever, colonial oppression. But in fact, it doesn't appear to be the case. And I think there's a lot of factors involved in that. I think it has to do with factions in the Kurdish movement. I think it has to do with factions in the Palestinian struggle to this day. It has a lot to do with ideology. It has a lot to do with praxis. It has a lot to do with tensions between, Kurdish people and then the Arab population that they also see as their oppressors in some ways. If you want, I can open that up a little bit more. But
Sure.
There are so many issues. Okay, so I'll start with. Like I said, I was. Kind of surprised coming from this Canadian leftist background when I realized, and it's, and the Palestinian liberation struggle here is very strong. And I realized that not every, it's across the board, it's very, very mixed, but there's a lot of nuance involved in it, and especially our relationship with the Palestinian movement. So I'd say first and foremost, it's because of Hamas. Our movement is not, I think it's really important to preface that the movement has been very clear and still is very much so. And in fact, we're waiting, we're waiting to hear what their next statement will be about the new developments, with the invasion in Lebanon. But they're very clear about that. We, of course, we condemn any kind of genocide, massacre, of a people's, especially in oppressed peoples, the Palestinian people. What Israel is doing there is war crimes. What Israel is doing there it has been condemned across the board. At the same time, though, because of the events of October 7th, which have been contextualized in many different ways, but because of the movement has also been the movement has also condemned Hamas's use of violence in their use of violence against the Israeli hostages during October 7th. And it's I think it's important to be cognizant of the fact that yes, when it's a liberation struggle, when it's an anti-oppression liberation struggle, of course violence is expected. We are ourselves very much involved in a self-defense struggle, right? Kurdish movement is involved in self-defense. However, there's a line where self-defense can become almost sadistic and actually really problematic. And I know there's a lot of controversy surrounding what happened those days and who was doing what, but there was a lot of violence against women, which we saw, and the Kurdish movement, cannot support that. And so they also condemned Hamas for the actions that day, taking into consideration the context and everything like that. But they are very adamant about the fact that they want this genocide in Palestine to stop. They want the massacre to stop. And then, I have my own personal opinions about it as well. I think it's very complicated. So I guess that's kind of the movement. So the movement, of course, in terms of ideology and praxis, is just so far away from Hamas, from Hezbollah. Now we have Hezbollah mixed in on this, and ideologically very much opposed. In fact, a lot of the Kurdish people will, when it comes to jihadists, like groups of any kind, they're just super, understandably, because of what happened with ISIS in the autonomous administration of North and Eastern Syria, they are very, they're super sensitive towards any kind of like jihadist group getting into power. And so I think there's that hesitancy. The other thing is, I don't know, should I keep going, or
Sure.
do you want to take a, okay. I'd say the other thing is how both Tayyip Erdoğan, the president of Turkey since like 2002, he was the prime minister and then he switched to president. And that's a whole, but he's like he's the dictator of Turkey, essentially. Him and Netanyahu have been playing a very dirty game. And they've basically been sort of pitting the two communities against each other. So for example, I think this dates back to Mavi Marmara, which if I'm not mistaken, was in 2008. Just correct me if I'm wrong about that. And that's where, there was this watershed between the relationship between Palestinians and then Turkey, because there were 8 or 9, I believe, Turkish citizens that were killed on that flotilla on its way to give aid to Gaza in 2008. And then the Israeli, the IDF, just assassinated them along with many others. So I remember very clearly that was like some watershed moment. And then I think Turkey really took every opportunity that they could to use this to garner support from not just the Palestinians, but actually the Arab world in general for their own
internally within Turkey as well, right?
Of course, yeah, within their their own neo-Ottoman project, and then at the same time, it really plays very well for them when it comes against the against the Kurdish people, and so then Netanyahu, I think, also saw an opportunity here. When they saw how much solidarity was being created between Hamas and Turkey at the time, didn't hesitate to then start getting on their soapbox or him getting on his soapbox and starting to say, Turkey is killing all their Kurdish peoples and it's just outrageous. And it's absolutely atrocious what's happening to the Kurdish people in Turkey, the colonized people. But at the same time, the irony that Netanyahu will get up on we'll sit there and talk about, all of the Kurdish people, that have been under occupation and have been massacred, and an ongoing genocide, very much so, when they are perpetuating their own genocide, and vice versa for Turkey. Turkey to go and be like, oh, the poor Palestinian children, when meanwhile they have, they just razed to the ground like many Kurdish cities very recently in the last self-defense war, or the trench warfare, as they call it. And then, of course, what we've been seeing, right now, Turkey is invading, both Bashur or, southern Kurdistan, occupied Iraq, and then also, and still, of course, to this day, like Rojava or the autonomous administration, very much so, yeah.
So, as you've been saying, kind of, despite efforts to kind of co-opt both causes and to instrumentalize the violence that's being done against both people, the Kurdish movement kind of in its statements has trod to the line that you've described, and has been kind of unequivocal in its condemnation of the genocide, while also pursuing its own political program. But of course, the Kurdish movement, it's also there on the ground in the Middle East, and in a region, in regions which are now being kind of directly affected by the spiraling conflicts. It's a very big question. Kurdistan is, between several countries. But could you maybe just sketch a bit what have been the sort of geopolitical changes for the Kurdish movement as a result of this widening conflict? What position are they going to have?
I mean, I think with the latest invasion of Lebanon, we are all, waited with a bated breath to see what the movement might make because it doesn't appear that they've made a statement yet, particularly about the latest invasion. I don't believe that they're particularly sympathetic to Hezbollah, but I believe that they are very much against. I mean, I don't want to speak for their movement by any means, but I think they are very much against also the massacre of any peoples, especially civilians, and then also particularly people that are under any kind of oppression. So. Yeah, I think we are all just sort of waiting to see. The implications, of course, are huge because Iran is involved in this, and then Iran, we have a very, antagonistic. I don't want to say relationship, but like the antagonistic stance with Iran, of course, and then the way that they've been treating their Kurdish peoples in Rojava, but then also the implications that this has for the autonomous administration. The media defense area has been under attack. I mean, we are just hearing like left, right, and center about drone attacks. There was a recent one of the two Kurdish women journalists, Tara Mehedin. I'm sorry, I'm missing the name right now. I had it, but you know who I'm talking about, right?
Yeah, we're killed in a drone strike in Iraqi Kurdistan.
Yeah. Sorry about that. Tara Bahad. No, but I think I'm mixing up the names, right? Because one is Tara. I had it right here. I'm sorry.
Gulistan Tara and Tara.
Gulistan Tara, exactly, and Behadin, right? Behadin. Anyway, you can. I don't know what you're gonna do with that, but sorry about that. I just didn't have it right at my fingertips. I'm sure you can manage. So yeah. The other thing is like, in terms, I mean, you're talking, so the geopolitical situation. So of course, October 7th was also like a watershed for, I mean, in many ways for the Palestinians, it really wasn't, because there's been this, ongoing occupation ever since the Nakba. But at the same time, they also are, that said, that put up many things into motion. And right now we're seeing the effects of all of that. And of course, with the Kurdish movement, with the Kurdish struggle being across those four nations, every single one of these is implicated. And maybe, I realize here that there is some pushback because people think, like, people are just assuming that the Kurdish struggle would be, supportive of, would be supportive of Intifada, I guess. And there is some, elements of that. Like, I think, for example, like some of the most hardliners of Kurdish movements, like Duran Kalkan or Ali Karasu, I believe like they have come right out and said, we have 13 martyrs. We were together in Bekaa Valley. We do not support Israel Zionism whatsoever. We don't support Israel Zionism. We find that, as October 10th is approaching, right, which is the beginning of the conspiracy against Abdullah Öcalan that got him in prison, that led to his eventual capture and imprisonment. They find that they know that Mossad played a large role in that as well. So it's extremely nuanced. It's very complicated. I also think that it's very hard for the Kurdish peoples, especially like the diaspora communities or the communities, to see like all of this attention on the Palestinian struggle when they themselves feel like they have been, they've also gone through a horrific, I mean, they're going through an ongoing horrific genocide themselves, and they just don't feel like it's getting as much attention or airtime. And I think that that's a little hard for them to take sometimes because, it feels like no one cares about what's going on with the Kurdish people. And then they're on, I mean, and then I'm kind of like, well, thank God like at least we don't have like 40,000 people that have been, killed since October, right? Since it'll be it'll be a year just in a couple of days. And we should be thankful for that. But at the same time, I mean, the thousands, it's like, how much of a temporal aspect do you want to put on this? It's like the thousands of people have been and continue to be killed in the Kurdish struggle for liberation.
Sure. Perhaps then, as you've kind of explained today, the Kurdish movement faces is a very difficult point for a number of reasons, geostrategically, ideologically, and is trying to navigate this developing situation in the Middle East as best it can. Are there any ways in which this movement could offer a progressive alternative? It's hard to see, I think, now sort of ways forward, in Kurdistan, in Israel, Palestine, or elsewhere in the Middle East, but can this movement offer an alternative?
Yeah, I think that's also where they're very much like hesitant and ideologically opposed and opposed ideologically, because our project is democratic confederalism. Our project is, coming from the tradition of Abdullah Öcalan and Serokati. This is, this is a sort of a social ecological egalitarian revolution, and is a framework actually for a blueprint for the Middle East, as we're well aware, and it has so much potential, and we've seen it in praxis in Rojava, and we've seen it. We've seen some aspects of it in the autonomous administrations during the self-defense wars but I think our larger project is we really do see how democratic confederalism could offer a solution to some of the largest problems in the Middle East right now, in these geopolitical considerations. Because I think that especially what we call the Western anti-imperialists here, in North America at least, I don't know, I don't want to speak for Europe necessarily, but they just have a tendency to support anything that's anti-American, and in fact we've gotten some backlash from them because they're saying, oh, you got supported by America during the YPG, and I mean during the siege of ISIS. And it's like, well, yes, of course we did, because what was the alternative? There was going to be a genocide, there was going to be a massacre, there would have also, I mean, America did such a great job of arming ISIS themselves that it just seems like that would anyway. I don't want to get too off topic, but I'm just saying, like, we see the promise in our ideological project, and then what I'm trying to say is that the left, like the international left, is very quick to support what they see as like anti-American, sort of imperialist regimes, but then they're not actually like, you have to sort of examine the ideology that's behind it. Yeah. And so, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe both Hamas and Hezbollah are arguing for Sharia law. And I don't think that that's anything that the Kurdish movement can get behind, because that is actually like, that is entirely, our ideological and practical framework is completely against that.
Yeah.
For many reasons.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Elif, for joining us today. And it's such a complicated issue to discuss. So thank you for trying to compress all of this history, all of these countries, and all of these ideological issues as well into the short time that we have. But I hope this will encourage people as well to read I forget the name. There's an excellent article you published in 2020 exploring some of these issues in more detail, which people can find by searching your name, by going on your website. And I hope you'll join us here again. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. And if I may, I just want to say that, like, I still think there is, when it comes to the peoples, like on the ground, I still think there is a lot of there's a lot of potential. Like you said, I know that the women's movement, the Kurdish women's movement, has been making a lot of effort to connect with Palestinian feminists. and what remains of them. I mean, that's the thing. This is the part of the Palestinian struggle that has actually appears to have become quite marginalized itself. And that's also, I think, important, is that the tradition that we have together in Bekaa Valley, and that solidarity is been exacerbated by the fact that the representation has changed dramatically, especially in terms of like ideology and practice. So I think there's still potential for the peoples themselves, and I'm hoping that the Palestinian people can see the potential for how Kurdish movements, how we could once again like learn from each other.
Yeah.
Anyway,
I think that's a hopeful note to conclude on.
Yeah, I wanted to just.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Elif Genç, for joining us. This has been the Kurdistan Connection with myself, Matt Broomfield, here on Media News. Until the next program, goodbye.